I still remember the moment I found out. It was one of those quiet Sunday mornings that I'd come to love, sunlight streaming through the windows, the smell of fresh coffee, the familiar sounds of our life together filling the house. Emma was still asleep upstairs, and I was in the kitchen, scrolling through my emails on her laptop, which she'd left open on the counter. My phone had died overnight, and I just needed to quickly check a message from work. That's when I saw it. A Facebook tab was open, the messages already loaded on the screen. At first, I wasn't paying attention, I wasn't interested in her social media, and I figured she'd left it open by accident. But a few lines of text caught my eye as I was about to close it. Phrases like, "You make me feel alive again," and "I wish I could tell you all of this in person." My stomach tightened. For a second, I told myself I was misreading it. Maybe she was talking to a friend, confiding in someone about some feelings she'd never told me. But the more I read, the worse it got. The messages were with a man named Liam. I didn't recognize the name, and from what I could gather, she hadn't mentioned him before. They'd been talking for weeks, maybe even months, and the messages had started off casually enough. But as I scrolled back through their history, I saw how their conversations had deepened over time, each message becoming more personal, more intimate. I felt a sick, twisting sensation in my chest as I kept reading, but I couldn't stop. It was like I was in a trance, watching my life unravel in real time. She told him things she hadn't told me in years, about feeling lonely, about feeling unappreciated, about feeling like she was invisible in her own home. And he responded with the kind of attention and empathy that I hadn't given her, at least not recently. He made her feel seen, important. And she soaked it up, message by message, until she was pouring her heart out to this stranger in a way I thought she'd only ever do with me. There wasn't anything explicitly sexual in their texts, no dirty pictures, no plans to meet up. But somehow, that didn't make it any easier to swallow. If anything, it made it worse. This wasn't just some impulsive fling. This was something deeper, something that went beyond physical attraction. This was Emma's heart, her thoughts, her emotions, all given to a man she'd never met. And I was left with the scraps. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the screen. My hands felt cold, my chest tight, my mind racing in 100 different directions. I felt betrayed, but I also felt guilty. I started running back through the past few months, wondering if I'd missed the signs, wondering if this was somehow my fault. Had I been neglecting her? Was I so wrapped up in my work, in my own routine, that I hadn't noticed her slipping away? Eventually, I closed the laptop, took a shaky breath, and went upstairs. She was still asleep, curled up under the blankets, her face peaceful, innocent. Looking at her like that, it was hard to reconcile this image with the one I'd just discovered, the woman who'd been confiding in another man, sharing parts of herself I thought were mine alone. I wanted to shake her awake, to demand an explanation, to force her to tell me what the hell was going on. But instead, I stood there, feeling paralyzed. How do you confront someone about something like this? How do you accuse them of infidelity when there's no proof of anything physical, only a trail of words and feelings? I didn't even know if she'd see it as cheating. Maybe she'd tell me I was overreacting, that they were just friends, that it was all innocent. But I didn't feel innocent. I felt like my whole world had been knocked off its axis, and I was left standing there, unsure of how to move forward. I went back downstairs and sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at my coffee. I thought about confronting her, but the idea of her brushing it off, or worse, defending him, made my stomach turn. So I sat there, letting the silence of the morning wash over me, trying to make sense of something that felt senseless. In that moment, one thought kept echoing in my mind, over and over: is an emotional affair any different from a physical one? And if not, could I ever forgive her? I spent the rest of that day drifting through the house like a ghost. Emma could tell something was wrong. She kept glancing over at me with that little crease in her forehead, the one she gets when she's worried. Every time she asked me if I was okay, I mumbled something about work or a headache, just to keep her off my trail. I couldn't confront her yet. I needed time to process, to figure out what I was even going to say. But by the evening, the silence between us felt unbearable, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I knew I couldn't keep pretending. I'd read enough of those messages to know this wasn't something I could ignore or brush off. She'd crossed a line I didn't even realize we had until I saw how deeply it had been crossed. After dinner, when she went into the kitchen to wash up, I followed her. My heart was pounding, and my hands felt cold, but I took a deep breath and forced the words out before I could stop myself. "Emma, who's Liam?" She froze, her hand still clutching a dish towel. For a second, I saw the shock on her face, the guilt flashing in her eyes. But then, just as quickly, she composed herself, turning back to the sink with forced calm. He's just a friend," she said, her voice too casual, too controlled. "Just a friend?" I repeated, trying to keep the bitterness out of my voice. "Since when do you tell a friend that he makes you feel alive, that you wish you could talk to him in person?" Her shoulders tensed, and she turned to look at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of guilt and defensiveness. "Ben, it's not what you think," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were just talking. It didn't mean anything." I let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through my hair. "Didn't mean anything?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Emma, I read those messages. I saw the things you told him, the things you haven't told me in years. How can you stand there and tell me it didn't mean anything?" Her face crumpled, and she looked away, unable to meet my eyes. "I didn't mean for it to get like that," she whispered. "At first, it was just someone to talk to. Someone who understood. Someone who understood." I felt a surge of anger rise up in me, sharper and hotter than I'd expected. "Emma, I'm supposed to be that person for you. We're supposed to talk to each other. Isn't that what marriage is?" She looked down, her hands twisting the dish towel. "You're always so busy, Ben," she said quietly. "I know you work hard, and I know you're trying to build a life for us, but, sometimes, it feels like you're not really here. Like I'm invisible." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words caught in my throat. Somewhere, in the back of my mind, I knew there was truth in what she was saying. I'd been working longer hours, taking on more projects, telling myself it was for us. But maybe, without realizing it, I'd been slowly pulling away, drifting into my own world while assuming she'd always be there waiting for me. But that didn't change the fact that she'd turned to someone else. She'd confided in him, shared parts of herself that I hadn't even realized she was keeping from me. "So you just decided to find someone else?" I managed, my voice shaking. "You thought it was okay to build this emotional connection with some stranger online instead of talking to me?" She shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. "It wasn't like that. I was lonely, Ben. I needed someone to talk to. And Liam, he was just there. It felt safe, because it was online, because it wasn't real." "Not real?" The words stung, filling me with a cold, hollow feeling. "So all those things you told him, they didn't mean anything?" She hesitated, and that brief pause told me everything I needed to know. "I don't know," she whispered finally. "I know I was wrong. I know I crossed a line. But I don't know why I did it. I didn't think it would hurt you like this, because it wasn't physical." I took a step back, feeling like the ground was slipping out from under me. "Do you really think it matters that it wasn't physical?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Do you really think that makes it okay? You gave him a part of you, Emma. A part that's supposed to be mine." Her face crumpled, and she covered her mouth with her hand, stifling a sob. "I'm sorry, Ben," she choked out. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't know what to say. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into a darkness I didn't understand. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to hold her and tell her we'd get through this. But another part of me felt shattered, betrayed in a way I hadn't thought possible. I didn't know if I'd ever be able to trust her again, not fully, not after this. Finally, I turned away, my throat tight. "I don't know if I can do this," I whispered, more to myself than to her. "I don't know if I can be with someone who feels like I'm not enough." Her sobs filled the silence, echoing through the kitchen, but I couldn't bring myself to turn back and face her. All I could feel was the cold weight of her betrayal, pressing down on me, suffocating me. And in that moment, I didn't know if there was any way forward from here. I spent the night on the couch, lying in the dark, staring at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come. My mind was racing, replaying every message I'd read, every word she'd said. I kept asking myself how we'd gotten here, how the woman I'd promised to love and protect could betray me in a way that felt so profound, yet so intangible. There had been no physical affair, she hadn't even met the guy in person. But somehow, knowing that her heart and mind had been given to someone else hurt just as much as if she'd slept with him. Maybe more. The next morning, I could hear her moving around in the bedroom, her footsteps hesitant, like she was afraid to come out and face me. I wasn't sure I wanted to face her either. My chest felt heavy, raw, like an open wound that hadn't even begun to scab over. I wasn't ready to talk, but we couldn't ignore this. Ignoring it was probably what had brought us here in the first place. Eventually, I dragged myself off the couch and went into the kitchen, just as she was coming down the stairs. She looked like she hadn't slept, her eyes puffy and red, her face pale. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her, almost wanted to reach out and tell her it would be okay. But then the memory of those messages, of her words to him, flared up in my mind, and the sympathy turned to anger again. We stood there in silence, both of us unsure of what to say, how to even begin. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Ben, please, can we talk about this?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and we both sat down at the kitchen table. She clasped her hands together, staring down at them like she couldn't bear to look at me. "I know I hurt you," she began, her voice trembling. "I know what I did was wrong. I don't have an excuse, but I just need you to understand why it happened." I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my voice steady. "Fine," I said. "Explain it to me. Explain why I wasn't enough for you." She winced at my words, her face twisting with guilt. "It's not that you weren't enough, Ben. You've always been everything to me. But over the last year, I started feeling invisible. You were always working late, always busy, and I felt like I was just here, waiting for scraps of your time." I opened my mouth to argue, but she held up her hand, stopping me. "Please, just let me finish," she said, her voice barely holding together. "I didn't reach out to him, Ben. He messaged me one day, just out of the blue. I don't even know why I replied. Maybe I was just lonely, or maybe I wanted. I don't know. Validation? Attention? But once we started talking, I felt like I mattered again. He was interested in me, in what I had to say. And I got lost in that." The words stung, each one a twist of the knife already lodged in my chest. "So I was just someone you settled for?" I asked bitterly. "And he was what? The person you really wanted to talk to?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, Ben. That's not it at all. I love you. I've always loved you. But somewhere along the way, I lost myself in this routine. And I didn't know how to talk to you about it. I thought if I told you I was unhappy, you'd... I don't know. I thought you'd think I was ungrateful, or that I didn't appreciate everything you do for us." I took a deep breath, trying to hold back the flood of emotions swirling inside me. "So you didn't talk to me. You went to him instead. You told him things you couldn't tell your own husband. Do you have any idea how humiliating that is? She nodded, looking down, her shoulders slumped. I know. And I'm sorry. I know that word isn't enough, but I am. I wish I could take it back, Ben. I wish I'd never responded to him. I know I crossed a line that I can never uncross. We sat there in silence, her apology hanging in the air between us, hollow and heavy. I wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that this was just some horrible mistake, some lapse in judgment. But a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that the damage had already been done, that something essential between us had broken the moment she'd let another man into her heart. After a while, I asked, Did you ever plan to meet him? She shook her head immediately. No, never. It wasn't like that. I don't even know what he looks like in real life. It was safe, in a twisted way, because it was just online. I never had any intention of meeting him. I swear to you, Ben, I never wanted it to go beyond the screen. I sighed, feeling a mix of relief and bitterness. Part of me wanted to believe her, to accept that this was just a virtual fantasy that had gotten out of control. But another part of me wondered if that even mattered. Physical or not, she'd shared things with him that should have been ours. And I didn't know if I could live with that. I don't know how to trust you again, I said finally, my voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to move past this. She reached out, her hand covering mine. I'll do whatever it takes, Ben. I'll cut off all contact with him. I'll delete every message, block every account. I don't want to lose you. I looked down at her hand on mine, feeling the warmth of her skin, and for a second, I felt that old familiarity, that connection that had once seemed unbreakable. But now, it was fragile, a thin thread holding us together in the aftermath of something I never thought we'd face. I need time, I said, pulling my hand away. I don't know if I can just forgive this. Not yet. She nodded, her face crumpling with fresh tears. I understand. Just, please don't give up on us. I know I don't deserve it, but please. I didn't answer. I couldn't. All I knew was that the woman sitting across from me was both familiar and foreign, someone I loved and someone who had hurt me more deeply than I thought possible. And as I got up and walked out of the room, I realized that I didn't know if I could ever look at her the same way again. Let me know if you want to keep going in this direction, exploring the slow and painful process of healing and whether they can rebuild trust, or if you'd like to shift the focus to something else. The days that followed felt like walking through a fog. Emma and I moved around each other cautiously, as if we were afraid of bumping into the wreckage we'd created. I could sense her trying, in her own way. She'd make my coffee just the way I liked it, leave little notes with apologies, or linger near me as if waiting for some sign that things would be okay. But I couldn't give her that. I didn't have it in me. At night, I took to sleeping in the guest room. It wasn't something we'd talked about or agreed upon, it just happened. The idea of lying next to her, of feeling her so close but knowing she'd been emotionally miles away, was too painful. So I slept on that narrow, uncomfortable bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the hollowness of the house in a way I never had before. Emma would knock on the door every night, ask if I wanted to talk, if there was anything she could do. I'd mumble something about needing space, or tell her I was too tired. I didn't want to talk, I didn't want to confront the anger and sadness that were simmering just below the surface. I didn't want to say something I'd regret. During the day, I buried myself in work. I stayed at the office longer than usual, found excuses to work late, take on extra projects. Anything to avoid going home, where the silence between us was deafening. I'd always thought of our home as a place of comfort, somewhere I could relax and unwind. Now, it felt like a stranger's house, a place full of painful reminders of what had happened, of what we'd lost. The worst part was, I missed her. Even though she was right there, even though I was the one who'd put up this wall, I missed her presence, her warmth. I missed how things used to be, when we could talk without the weight of a betrayal hanging between us. I kept finding myself remembering little things, her laugh, the way she'd hum when she was cooking, the way she'd lean her head on my shoulder when we watched TV. It hurt to realize how much I'd taken those things for granted. One night, about a week after the confrontation, she knocked on the door of the guest room again. This time, she didn't just leave when I didn't respond. She opened the door slowly, her face peeking in, tentative and full of sorrow. "Ben, please," she whispered, stepping inside. "I know you're hurt, and I know you need space, but I'm falling apart here. Can we just talk? Please." I sighed, feeling the weariness seep into my bones. I couldn't keep ignoring her, couldn't keep pushing this off. Maybe she was right, maybe we needed to talk. I sat up, running a hand through my hair. "Fine," I said, my voice rough. "Let's talk." She sat down on the edge of the bed, keeping a respectful distance. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. She was staring down at her hands, twisting her fingers nervously, and I was watching her, wondering how this woman, the woman I loved, the woman I thought I knew, could have done something that felt so alien, so out of character. Finally, she broke the silence. I don't know how to make this right," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I've hurt you, and I know I can't take it back, but I need you to know that I'm so sorry. I would do anything to fix this." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice. "I don't understand, Emma. I don't understand how you could share those parts of yourself with someone else. How you could confide in him, when I thought we were supposed to be a team." She looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know. I don't even know who I was when I was talking to him. It's like I was so caught up in feeling seen, feeling like I mattered to someone, that I lost sight of everything else. Of what I had with you." Her words hit me, sharp and painful. "So you felt like you didn't matter to me?" I asked, the bitterness creeping into my voice despite my efforts to hold it back. She shook her head, wiping a tear from her cheek. "No, not exactly. But you were so busy, Ben. I know you were working hard for us, for our future, but it felt like I was just a piece of the background in your life. Like I could have disappeared, and you wouldn't have noticed." I clenched my fists, trying to hold back the anger bubbling up. "That's not fair, Emma. I was working for us. I thought we were on the same page, that you understood why I was putting in those hours, making those sacrifices." She nodded, her face twisted in regret. "I did understand, at first. But over time, I guess I started feeling resentful. Like I was waiting on the sidelines while your life moved forward. And then Liam, he just showed up, and he filled that space. I know it was wrong, I know it was a terrible mistake, but I felt so alone, Ben." Hearing her say that word, alone, made something inside me crack. I had always thought of myself as a good husband, a steady partner, someone she could rely on. But here she was, telling me that I'd made her feel invisible, that I'd been too wrapped up in my own life to notice her slipping away. I looked away, swallowing hard. "So, what now?" I asked, feeling the exhaustion settle into my bones. "What are we supposed to do with all of this?" She reached out, her hand hovering near mine, hesitant. "I want to rebuild this. I know it won't be easy, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want to try. If you're willing to try with me." I felt the weight of her words, the sincerity in her voice. Part of me wanted to reach out, to take her hand and tell her we could get through this, that we could find our way back. But another part of me, the part that still felt raw and betrayed, couldn't make that leap just yet. "I don't know, Emma," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again." She nodded, a fresh wave of tears sliding down her cheeks. "I understand. Just, please don't give up on us yet." Let me prove to you that I can be better, that I can make this right. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I saw the fear in her eyes, the fear of losing everything, of losing us. And in that moment, I realized that I didn't want to lose us either. But wanting to hold on and actually being able to forgive were two different things. Maybe we can try, I said finally, my voice cracking. But it's going to take time. She nodded, relief flooding her face. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you, Ben. I'll wait as long as it takes. We sat there in silence, side by side but still worlds apart, each of us wondering if time and effort could heal something that felt so irrevocably broken. And as I sat there, a small part of me dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back. After that conversation, things didn't magically get better. There was no grand moment of forgiveness, no instant relief. We were still both raw and hurt, both cautious, afraid of stepping on each other's wounds. But for the first time since I discovered her messages, I felt like there was a path forward. A hard, messy, uphill path, but a path nonetheless. We agreed to try counseling. Emma suggested it, and at first, I felt a strange resistance to the idea. Part of me wanted to believe that we could figure this out on our own, that we didn't need a stranger digging around in our problems. But I also knew that something inside me was cracked, that my trust was broken, and I wasn't sure I could piece it back together without help. Our first session was uncomfortable. We sat on opposite ends of a couch in a softly lit office, the walls lined with abstract art and inspirational quotes that felt oddly out of place given the heaviness we were carrying. The therapist, a calm woman with kind eyes, started with gentle questions, asking us to describe what had brought us there. Emma was quick to take responsibility, her voice trembling as she admitted to the emotional affair, to the messages I'd found. I saw her face crumple as she described how she'd felt, lonely, neglected, forgotten. I could see her trying to be as honest as she could, even if it made her look bad. When it was my turn, I didn't know where to start. I wanted to tell the therapist that I'd been blindsided, that I'd had no idea Emma was feeling this way. I wanted to tell her that I'd been a good husband, that I'd been working hard to build a life for us. But as I listened to myself, I realized how defensive I sounded, like I was more interested in proving I was right than understanding where we went wrong. The therapist listened patiently, occasionally nodding, letting us speak without interruption. Then she asked a question that surprised me. When was the last time you two felt truly connected? The room fell silent. I glanced at Emma, and she looked down, fidgeting with her hands. I searched my memory, trying to find a moment that fit, but it was harder than I'd expected. Life had gotten so busy, so routine, that the little moments of intimacy had faded without me even noticing. I thought about the times we'd gone out to dinner, only to end up checking our phones halfway through the meal, or the nights when we'd be in the same room but barely spoke beyond a few words. Finally, Emma spoke up. I think, it was maybe 2 years ago. We went on that weekend trip to the mountains. We were hiking, and there was this view at the top. I remember we just stood there, holding hands, not saying anything. She paused, her voice thick with emotion. I remember feeling like we were completely in sync. Like we didn't need words. I remembered that trip, too. I remembered how close we'd felt, how easy everything had seemed. Back then, I'd thought moments like that would come around forever, that they didn't need special effort to maintain. Now, sitting there on that therapist's couch, I realized just how long it had been since we'd truly seen each other, really been with each other. The therapist gave us an assignment. Every night, we had to set aside 20 minutes to talk, uninterrupted. No phones, no distractions, just us, talking about anything except the affair or the pain it had caused. It sounded simple, but the first night we tried, it felt like pulling teeth. We sat across from each other in the living room, surrounded by the familiar clutter of our lives, and I struggled to find something to say that didn't sound forced or awkward. Emma broke the silence. She started talking about a book she was reading, some mystery novel she'd picked up to take her mind off things. She described the plot, her voice a little too bright, a little too eager, but I could tell she was trying. I listened, nodding, giving a few half-hearted responses, but it felt stilted, like we were two strangers on a first date. When she finished talking, we sat there in silence again, both of us acutely aware of the tension in the room. But we kept at it, night after night. Some days were better than others. Sometimes we'd talk about little memories from when we first started dating, moments we hadn't thought about in years. Other times we'd talk about nothing important at all, movies, work, plans for the weekend. Slowly, those conversations started to feel less forced, less like an exercise and more like us. Real, if tentative. One night, she shared something that surprised me. "I deleted all my social media accounts," she said quietly, not looking at me. I felt a flicker of something, relief, maybe, or gratitude. "Why?" I asked, though I could guess. She sighed. I realized it was too easy to get lost in it. Talking to strangers, getting attention from people who didn't know me, it felt good, but it wasn't real. And I don't want to lose myself in that again. I don't want any more distractions. I just want us. I didn't know what to say. There was something raw in her words, something that felt like a promise. It was a small step, maybe even just a gesture, but it meant something. It was like she was finally putting in the effort to face the things she'd avoided, the things we'd both avoided. Over the next few weeks, the walls between us started to come down, piece by painful piece. I found myself letting her in again, letting her touch my hand, letting her rest her head on my shoulder. There were moments when I'd feel the familiar pang of betrayal, that quick, sharp stab in my chest. But every time, I tried to remind myself that healing was a process, that forgiveness wasn't a one-time choice but something I'd have to keep choosing, over and over. Then, one night, after weeks of carefully rebuilding trust, she looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "Thank you for giving me a chance to make this right. I know I don't deserve it, but, thank you." In that moment, I realized that maybe this was what love was. Not just the easy, happy moments, but the willingness to fight through the pain, to wade through the hurt and anger because something inside told you that the person on the other side was worth it. I didn't know if we were fixed. I didn't know if I'd ever fully forget what had happened. But as she held my hand and looked at me with gratitude and remorse, I felt a quiet, tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, we were going to be okay. That I and the weeks that followed, our lives began to take on a new shape. It wasn't the life we'd had before, and I don't think it ever would be. The innocence, the trust I'd once felt, those were things you couldn't just snap back into place. But there was something else growing in its place, something quieter, perhaps stronger. It felt like we were learning to see each other again, with all our faults, all our scars laid bare. We kept going to counseling, and each session chipped away at the resentment and the pain we'd both been carrying. I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't before. I talked about my own feelings of inadequacy, the pressure I'd put on myself to provide, to be the strong one for us. I admitted that sometimes, I'd used work as a way to escape, to avoid confronting the growing distance between us. I had convinced myself that providing for her financially was the same as being there emotionally. Looking back, I could see how wrong I'd been. Emma listened, really listened. She didn't interrupt, didn't defend herself or shift the blame. For the first time, it felt like she wasn't just waiting to respond, she was trying to understand. And that alone made a difference, more than I could have predicted. She told me how it felt to be in the shadows of my life, how she'd started to feel invisible. But she also took responsibility, admitting that instead of addressing those feelings, she'd turned to someone else to fill the void. She owned her choices, and somehow, that made the wound a little less raw. The therapist helped us set boundaries, new rules to help rebuild trust. Emma had deleted her social media accounts, and she showed me her phone whenever I asked. Not that I wanted to check it, I didn't want to become the kind of person who was constantly suspicious, constantly looking over her shoulder. But the fact that she offered, willingly, showed me that she was committed to transparency. She wanted to prove she was trustworthy again, even if it took time. There were still hard days. Sometimes, I'd wake up and feel the weight of it all pressing down on me, the memory of those messages replaying in my mind. I'd lie there, feeling sick, wondering if I'd made the right choice to stay, if I'd ever be able to let this go. I'd question myself, question her, and the doubts would gnaw at me like a constant, quiet ache. Those were the days when forgiveness felt impossible. But on the good days, I could see progress. I could feel it in the way we laughed again, the way we could sit together without that awful tension. We started finding small ways to connect, cooking meals together, going for walks, leaving our phones behind. We rediscovered the small pleasures we'd forgotten, like the way she'd dance around the kitchen while waiting for water to boil, or the way I'd make up ridiculous stories about our neighbors. Bit by bit, we were remembering what it was like to enjoy each other, to just be present. One evening, we went out for dinner, just the two of us. It felt strange at first, sitting across from her in a restaurant, trying to push the past out of my mind. But as the evening wore on, we started to relax, the conversation flowing more naturally. We talked about work, about places we wanted to visit, even joked about the terrible reality shows we'd gotten hooked on. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we were on a date, not as a struggling couple, but as two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Toward the end of the night, Emma reached across the table, her hand resting on mine. "I know I can never erase what I did, Ben," she said softly. "But I want you to know that I'm here for you, however you need me to be. I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, or even completely. But I hope, someday, you can feel safe with me again." I looked at her, really looked at her, and I saw the weight she was carrying too. She wasn't just waiting for me to forgive her, she was forgiving herself, learning to live with the regret and the shame. And somehow, seeing her take ownership of that made me feel lighter, like maybe we could both let go of some of the pain we'd been holding. "I want that too," I said, squeezing her hand. "I want to trust you again. I don't know if we'll ever get back to how things were, but maybe we can find something new, something better." She smiled, a soft, hopeful smile that felt fragile, like a flower blooming after a long winter. "I'd like that," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. After that night, things weren't magically fixed, but they were different. We kept moving forward, step by small step, rebuilding our marriage with intention, with care. I stopped working late as much, started prioritizing time with her. She made an effort too, finding ways to reconnect with herself, to build her own sense of purpose outside of just being my wife. We both put in the work, and slowly, it started to feel like we were creating something new, a relationship built on honesty, on vulnerability, on a shared commitment to be better than we were. One day, as I was packing up my things at the office, I found myself actually eager to get home. I wanted to see her, to tell her about my day, to hear about hers. And I realized that for the first time in months, the idea of going home felt warm again. It didn't feel like returning to a place of pain, but to a place where healing was possible. When I walked through the door, Emma looked up from the book she was reading and smiled, her eyes lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. "Hey," she said, setting the book down and coming over to hug me. I wrapped my arms around her, holding her close, feeling the comfort of her warmth, her presence. In that embrace, I felt something shift, a quiet but profound release. It was as if the weight I'd been carrying, the bitterness and hurt, was finally loosening its grip. It didn't mean everything was perfect, or that the scars had disappeared. But I was starting to see that healing didn't mean erasing the past, it meant accepting it, learning from it, and choosing to move forward anyway. As we stood there, holding each other, I realized that I did feel safe with her again. Not in the same innocent, unquestioning way I once had, but in a deeper, more resilient way. We had faced the worst together and had chosen, despite it all, to keep building. And maybe that was what real love was, not just the easy, joyful parts, but the choice to stay when things got hard, the commitment to rebuild even when it hurt. That night, lying in bed beside her, I reached out, took her hand, and held it tightly. She looked over at me, surprised, and I gave her a small smile. "I forgive you," I whispered. I wasn't sure if it was entirely true, but it was a beginning, a promise to keep trying, to keep choosing her, every day. She squeezed my hand, tears slipping down her cheeks, and whispered back, "Thank you." And as we lay there in the quiet, I felt a warmth growing between us, something fragile but real, a glimmer of hope that maybe, after everything, we were going to be okay.